Winter arrived ahead of schedule in 1887. Silent flakes drifted down like whispered secrets, covering fair hollows, uneven rooftops, and smoothing out the rough edges of every barn and chimney stack. When morning broke, the entire village appeared reborn, pristine and pure under its white blanket. Yet there was nothing gentle about the freezing temperatures, especially not in a forgotten place like this, where even the heavens seemed to turn their gaze elsewhere. Against the butcher shop's exterior wall, she waited. The morning sun painted the bricks a delicate rose color behind her. Mabeth Corbin, 31 years old, desperately impoverished and fragile as ice. A rip ran through her right sleeve, revealing an injury wrapped clumsily in dirty cloth. The wind and humiliation had colored her face crimson, while her light blonde hair hung in a tangled mess that had once been an attempt at braiding. Her footwear told its own story of hardship: mismatched boots, one with the toe completely worn through, the other far too big. Taken from a youngster, 5 children pressed against her sides, her flesh and blood, the sole force keeping her from surrendering to the frozen ground. Eli, barely 10, stood watchful, his expression carrying a weariness beyond his years. Ruthie cradled little Hiram, swaying him tenderly despite her trembling limbs. 5-year-old Joni cried without sound, burying her face in her clothing. Caleb scoured the snow desperately for any scrap of sustenance. Words had abandoned them. Their empty stomachs had stopped anticipating meals by late morning, and Mabeth Sheed exhausted her supply of desperate pleas several towns back. Jadodia Corbin, her deceased husband's brother, had forced them out. He'd counted exactly 3 months past the burial before declaring, "You mean nothing to me, and those children aren't my concern." He'd thrust her into the street with her wounded arm, and a shameful secret he dared her to reveal. She kept silent then. She remained silent still. Fair Hollow represented their final chance, though the community offered no compassion. A gentleman carrying fresh bread walked right past without acknowledgement. A woman emerging from the general store spotted the children's pleading eyes and clutched her money purse tighter. Nobody paused to help until Dawson Walker appeared. He arrived astride a dark horse-dusted white with snowflakes, wearing a wide hat pulled low. A scar traced down his left jaw, giving him an expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. 34 years old, broad-shouldered, and silent as frozen timber. He descended slowly, leather gloves gripping the reins firmly, initially saying nothing. The townsfolk observed him carefully. He walked beyond the huddled family, straight to the hitching post near the blacksmith's forge. After securing his mount, he pivoted around. His gaze found her storm-gray eyes beneath that lowered brim. No sympathy resided there, only assessment. Careful consideration. Then came those unexpected words. "You're coming with me." Maboth's eyes widened. "Sir, I don't." Her voice cracked from disuse. "I'm capable of working." "I mean to you and the children," he cut in. "You're coming now." She remained frozen. Eli moved protectively forward. "We're not asking for handouts. We don't want trouble." Dawson regarded him, then returned his attention to her. "Nobody mentioned trouble. I have space available. I have provisions. That's the situation." Ruthie murmured something to Joni, silencing the girl's tears. Still, Mabeth couldn't move. She felt the ache in her ribs, the bruising, the emptiness inside that hunger couldn't explain. She'd heard promises before. They always demanded payment. He seemed to understand her hesitation. Dawson approached closer. "I'm not offering tales or guarantees. Just come." The storm's worsening. Then he simply turned away. No dramatic gestures. No extended hand of charity. He walked to the wagon across the road, climbed up, and sat waiting, spine rigid as timber. Eli looked at her questioningly. "Mama, ... She examined their soaked, torn footwear, studied Hiram's ghostly complexion and chapped lips, looked at her own trembling, hands shaking from cold and something unnamed. Then she agreed. The children gathered their meager possessions, some rags, a small carved doll, a Bible with its cover torn away, and they followed. The journey to his property passed in silence. Wind howled across the open landscape, driving snow in sudden, painful bursts. Dawson offered no conversation, simply guided the reins like someone accustomed to solitude. The wagon groaned. Hiram whimpered softly. Joni buried her face against Maboth's chest. Every jolt sent pain through her injured arm. Yet she voiced no complaints. Dawson's property nestled within a pine grove, partially hidden by snowdrifts. A two-level cabin stood there, humble yet sturdy. Thin smoke rose from the chimney. A windmill creaked somewhere in the distance. When they stopped, Dawson descended and pushed open the cabin door without ceremony. The warmth flowing out felt like a kindness she'd forgotten existed. He gestured inside. Stoves burning. There's stew ready. You can eat? There's space upstairs. She paused at the entrance, holding Joni close. Sir, we're thankful, but I have no means of repayment. You don't owe me anything, he replied. Already attending to the horses? She stared, bewildered. He stopped, met her gaze for a prolonged moment, then spoke more gently. Not tonight, anyway. Inside, the cabin smelled of herbs, roasted meat, and burning cedar. She entered cautiously. The children followed, removing their wet coverings reverently. Ruthie wept quietly upon seeing the fireplace. Eli reached for the serving spoon, as though it might vanish. Caleb simply sat and gazed at the dancing flames. Mabeth knelt to remove their damp shoes, arranging them near the hearth. Dawson entered behind them, removed his coat, and hung it by the entrance. His shirt showed careful mending, his hands bore the marks of labor, his expression remained unreadable. I'll be out in the barn, he announced. But supper? She asked uncertainly. It's yours. Take what you need, and he departed. The quiet that followed his exit felt almost sacred. They ate out greedily, but with deep gratitude. Ruthie fed Hiram carefully, one spoonful at a time. Eli kept glancing toward the window, still uncertain this wasn't some dream. Mabeth barely registered the food's taste, but her hand steadied. That evening, she settled the children onto fresh quilts and straw pallets upstairs. The wood stove's warmth reached even there. Once they had finally drifted off, she sat alone in the dimness, hands folded in her lap, without a mirror. She could only imagine her appearance: wild hair, hollow cheeks, eyes ringed with exhaustion and shadow. She'd known kindness previously, but it always came with strings, words, demands, expectations. Dawson Walker had attached none of those. She descended quietly and opened the front door. The moon hung pale and frigid above the trees. He was outside tending the final horse. A lantern glowed nearby. She stood in the doorway, observing. Sir, she called softly. He turned. I heard the town's whispers, she said. I know their opinions of me. I won't damage your reputation. We'll leave soon. Dawson studied her for a long while. You think I'm concerned with their gossip? No, she admitted quietly, but I am. He wiped his hands on a rag, approached slowly. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Standing just feet away, he said, You didn't come knocking on my door. I brought you here. Remember that. She looked down. Still, folks will think what they want. He observed her briefly, then removed his coat. You're shivering. She tried refusing, but he draped it across her shoulders anyway. It felt heavy, warm, carried scents of leather, cedar, and faint tobacco smoke. She closed her eyes. You don't even know my name, she murmured. I do, he replied. It's Mabeth Corbin. Widow, mother of 5. No family except them. Injured arm, gentle voice, still fighting. She looked up, startled. You asked no questions? He stepped back, nodding once. Didn't mean I wasn't paying attention. She watched him vanish into the barn, heart pounding not from fear, but something unfamiliar, something deeper. Later, drifting toward sleep with her youngest curled beside her, the wind intensified again. Snow swept across the windows like murmured secrets. Down in the barn, Dawson Walker stared at a wooden container he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay an old wedding band and a letter from a woman who'd abandoned him. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he closed the lid, climbed to the loft, and let the silence keep him company, The house felt warmer now, not just from the fire, and in the darkness above. Mabeth Corbin dreamed not of rescue, but of a table with 7 seats and nobody missing. Tomorrow the town would gossip louder, but tonight Snow whispered only one truth. They were no longer alone. Snow continued to blanket the fields like divine needlework. But the days had stretched longer, sunlight lingering just enough to make the cabin feel like somewhere hope could take root. Even if quietly, to any outsider, Dawson Walker hadn't transformed much. He still woke before sunrise and worked fence posts until his muscles ached. Still kept quiet, still avoided town unless necessary. But within the house, things had changed, small things that hadn't existed before. There was laughter now. When Eli chopped kindling and Dawson offered a subtle nod of approval, the boy would beam as though he'd earned a trophy. When Joni got hiccups from gulping milk too quickly, Ruthie would giggle behind her hand while Caleb attempted teaching her breath-holding techniques. Hiram had begun crawling beneath Dawson's long legs when he sat at the table, resting his tiny head against the rancher's boot as though it belonged there. In Mabeth, she'd begun humming again. Initially, just under her breath, while mending clothes or stirring pots, her voice delicate as wind through wheat fields. But it traveled. It reached corners Dawson hadn't touched in years. Reached places inside him he'd thought permanently sealed. One evening, Dawson entered from the barn to find the children constructing something with wooden knit. Blocks near the hearth, Eli directing like a supervisor. Ruthie adding flowers she'd collected from thawing ground. Mabeth sat at the table, sewing buttons onto a shirt. One of Dawson's old ones. He paused, observing them all wordlessly. "You all right?" Mabeth asked, fingers continuing their work. Dawson inhaled deeply. "That shirt was my father's. I suspected as much. You kept it buried at the bottom of the drawer." She glanced upward. It had holes. I repaired them. He examined the thread she'd chosen, deep crimson like dried roses. "I didn't request that." She nodded. "I know. But I wanted to." He didn't respond, simply entered fully and hung his coat. The silence stretched between them, a familiar but gentler now. Not hollow. That week, Dawson brought Eli into town for supplies. The boy sat proudly on the seat, eyes wide, absorbing every detail. At the general store, Willa Darnell muttered something beneath her breath about strays and charity cases. Dawson ignored her, though Eli didn't. When they departed, he asked, "Why is she always talking sideways about Mama?" Dawson didn't look down. "Because some people need gossip to feel important." Eli squinted into the sunlight. "I don't like her." Dawson grunted. "You don't have to like her. Just don't become her." Back at the ranch, Mabeth was out back hanging laundry, her long hair tied with a worn ribbon. Ruthie sat on the porch combing Joni's curls, and Hiram slept curled like a kitten beside the doorway. Caleb helped sweep. Dawson handed her the supplies and said nothing. But that evening, while she washed dishes and he read by the fire, she asked, "Did Eli behave well in town?" "He stood his ground," Dawson replied simply. "He'll be a good man." She smiled at that. Later, after the children slept, she stepped onto the porch and found Dawson there, coat half fastened, watching the stars. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Too much noise in my thoughts?" She sat beside him. "Want to hear mine?" He looked at her sideways. "Do you want to share them?" She pulled her shawl tighter. "I remember when I first married. I thought it meant peace, security. But it was just another word for silence. My husband wasn't cruel, but he never truly heard me." Dawson waited. "I used to whisper to myself while cooking, just to hear someone speak my name. That's a loneliness no man should permit under his roof." She nodded. "You haven't." The wind shifted. Pine needles scattered across the yard. "I didn't intend to stay this long," she said. "Didn't want to become a burden, you're not?" His response came too quickly. Too certainly, she turned to face him. And he didn't look away. "The children," she said softly. "They smile now. That's because of you too." Dawson looked down. "I just provided fire and food." "No," she said, voice low. "You gave them a man who truly sees them. The silence that followed felt sacred, but not everyone in Fair Hollow shared their peace. One morning, Alzon rode into town alone. When he returned, his knuckles were scraped, his lips split. Eli noticed first. What happened? Dawson dismounted slowly. Someone needed education. Mapeth rushed out, eyes wide. Who hurt you? Nobody worth mentioning, he muttered, then looked her directly in the eye. Yadodi is in town. He's spreading lies. Mapeth went pale. He can't take them. The children. He attempted filing papers with the sheriff, Dawson said. Claimed you weren't fit, that they were neglected. They've never been safer, she said through clenched teeth. He didn't care when he left us to starve. Atasa nodded. Sheriff said the same. But he'll return. She stepped back, hand over her heart. If he takes them, he won't. Dawson's voice was steel. That night, Dawson stayed awake long after everyone slept. He sat at the kitchen table staring at a small wooden box. Inside was his mother's wedding ring, nestled in blue velvet. He hadn't opened it in years. He thought about what Mabeth had said about silence, about being invisible. He looked around the cabin, now quilts across the chairs. A doll on the windowsill, fresh biscuits cooling on a pan. He took the ring out. It gleamed as though it had waited all this time for precisely this moment. The next morning, Dawson rose early and rode to the blacksmith's. When he returned, he called Mabeth to the porch. She came, apron dusted with flour, hair loose in the wind. He handed her the ring box. She froze. I don't have elegant words for courtship, he said plainly. But this house is yours now, if you want it. She stared down at the velvet. Her hands trembled. Dawson, ... You don't owe me love, he said. I'm not asking for more than truth. But I'd be honored to call you wife. She didn't speak for a long time. Then softly her voice broke. There's something I haven't told you. He waited. She held Hiram's sleeping form, and her eyes filled. He's not just the youngest. He's not my late husband's son. Dawson's breathing remained slow but steady. She continued. My husband had a friend, a kind man, a freeman who helped us during the hardest winter. After my husband died, I was alone and hurt and grateful. And for one night, I wasn't. She paused. Hiram came from that night. Yadodia discovered the truth. Dawson's eyes never left hers. He didn't flinch. He didn't scowl. Instead, he stepped forward and looked down at the sleeping child. He reached out, brushed Hiram's soft hair, and said, A good man left this boy behind. I'll raise him with pride. Mabeth sobbed then quietly, like snow falling too heavily to be beautiful. Dawson pulled her close, careful not to wake the child. That evening, with no preacher and only the fire as witness, Dawson slid the ring onto her finger. Ruthie held a small flower, and Eli stood tall as best man. They didn't recite vows. They didn't need to. When Dawson leaned down and whispered, You're home now. Mabeth closed her eyes and smiled with dignity she'd thought forever lost. But Mare Hollow didn't forget easily. 2 days after the wedding, Yadodia returned with men, with documents. With loud voices intended to intimidate, he stood outside Dawson's home and shouted, You stole what doesn't belong to you. Dawson stepped out calmly. They were never yours to claim. She's got shame attached to her name. That boy isn't even white. Dawson didn't flinch. Sheriff Dane arrived, summoned by Dawson that morning. You'd best quiet yourself, the sheriff told Jadodia. I've got papers. Dane took the papers, examined them briefly, then tossed them into the snow. Old news? Invalid? You're siding with him? Yadodia barked. No, Dane said, looking toward the house. I'm siding with a man who gave 6 people a home when nobody else would. Yadodia lunged. Dawson met him with a single punch, clean, sharp, final. Yadodia collapsed into the snow like an exposed lie. Dawson turned back toward the porch. Mabeth stood there, hands clasped, her ring catching the afternoon sun. Beside her, all 5 children stood tall, eyes wide with wonder. Dawson walked up the steps, past their gaze, and said simply, "This house carries your name now," behind them. The door closed, not as a warning, but a promise. And outside, the town stood watching, no longer with judgment, but with something quieter, respect, or perhaps awe. But inside, a new life had already begun.